This is Icon 375 and I'm your instructor Megan. Last week I spoke a little bit about the choices that you have to make in information design, so what you want to say, how you're going to turn data into information and knowledge, interaction design, how audiences will interact with your message and what you're saying, and sensorial design, how you will present it with various media. The first article I had you read this week on narrative architectures is closely related to this concept because what Jenkins is explaining here is that you have a choice between 4 ways of designing your story, and each of the 4 choices offers different potentials for audience participation. So let's look at what those 4 stories are, and for each I'll explain why it has more or less potential for interaction and sensorial media. Remember that you will soon have to decide what your story you want to tell is and why you want to tell it, and that choice will determine which of these 4 narrative architectures you select to build. Jenkins starts by quoting game designer Ernest Adams, writing, "Interactivity is almost the opposite of narrative. Narrative flows under the direction of the author, while interactivity depends on the player for motive power." So one argument is that the more narrative you have, the less interactivity you can have, and vice versa. And again, as per last week's lecture, the amount that you have of each depends on what your goal is. If your audience really needs to experience the story, interactivity can be great. But if the audience really needs to connect emotionally, narrative might be a better choice for that particular emotion. Jenkins doesn't necessarily agree that we need to create this dichotomy between narrative and interactivity. He says that we can look at this in a different way, which is to think of what we're doing here as less as either building stories or building interactivity, but instead making spaces where narrative can take place. And Jenkins is writing about game design because this is an area of design in which the narrative versus interactivity dichotomy has been so common. This is an area where there's been lots of arguments that games should either focus on narrative or they should focus on interactivity. And so what Jenkins is saying is that people who create games aren't really picking either. They're not storytellers, they're not interactive designers, they're architects of spaces where stories and interaction happen. And that's where the term narrative architecture comes in, because the word architecture emphasizes that the author is building the space rather than the story and interactivity itself. And there are 4 different ways to create spaces, 4 different narrative architectures that Jenkins explains. They are evocative spaces, in which you build a space that recalls elements of a story, like the Star Wars Lego games, or the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal Studios. So evocative spaces tend to rely on using aspects of a narrative to get people to connect with a narrative that already exists. So the focus is on the characters and the scenery and elements of story. Enacting stories, where you place players at the center of micro-narratives that evoke specific emotional reactions, like the online game Spent, where you play as a person living in poverty and have to enact moments in the life of a person in poverty, like deciding to take a minimum wage job close to home or a higher paying job far away. These enacting stories rely on a player making some kind of interaction to advance the story. Let's take a look at Spent really quickly. So this is a narrative whose architecture relies heavily on interactivity. As the player, I make the choices that move any sense of narrative forward. Embedded narratives, which are unstructured narratives like Sunshine 69, which we'll look at in week 4 if you haven't already, These are part of a linear story that's been scattered and is experienced out of order or non-linearly. So in these types of stories, the story is already fixed and finished. The author has already written it. They've already created all of the media that are going to allow people to understand the story, and the interactivity is a lot smaller. Instead of influencing the story, the audience is merely clicking around and looking at different aspects of the story out of order. They're not actually able to influence the story. They're just learning about the story non-linearly. So it's a higher level of story and a lower level of interactivity. And finally, emergent narratives, which are sandbox worlds where there's less story and higher interactivity, like Second Life, Spore, or The Sims, where the audience can kind of do what they want. In fact, there's very, very little story in these emergent narratives because the audience has so much interactivity, they can kind of do whatever. The basics of story exist. There's a world. You can put people in it. The people have certain types of interactions. But beyond that, it's totally up to the choices the player or audience makes to determine what the narrative is. Therefore, the audience controls the narrative, and these are emergent narratives where they're making whatever story they want to occur in this space. So again, I had you read this because it's all about the choices you make in planning your narrative. Think of yourself as an architect. You're making a space that is either going to have more narrative or more interactivity in different balances. Which of the four you pick depends on the goal. Do you want lots of interactivity, or would you prefer to have lots of narrative? If you're trying to send a specific thematic message, an emergent narrative, for example, doesn't make sense because the audience can do whatever they want and just ignore the important parts of your message. The next piece I had you read was a piece on the hero's journey, which is a framework for storytelling. And I could really give you any of dozens or hundreds of frameworks for storytelling, but this is a common one in the transmedia world. There are others. I'm not really going to go into a deep review of the hero's journey in this video because I think it's a very self-explanatory text, probably the most self-explanatory text you'll read in this class. It's a framework in a linear order. So when planning your transmedia story, you just need to follow it. Beginning, middle, end, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. You're just going to write through that structure. Now, you don't necessarily have to present that structure to your audience in that order, but you're going to write it that way and then figure out whether or not you want to present each scene in order to the audience or whether you want more non-linear interactivity there. The only thing I want to add about the hero's journey is to stress that there are a few things to keep in mind when you start to use it. First, the hero doesn't just physically move through the scenes in the hero's journey. He or she or it also moves emotionally. This is very important. The journey is emotional and physical, so don't forget that. Second, you need to have transitions. The hero has to get from one scene to the next, and not by magic or luck. Third, always start with the time and place. Let people know where they are and what's going on a little bit. You need to make sure that the audience understands the setup for the world and what the rules of the world are. Finally, remember that narrative architecture is just one part of a bigger picture. Yes, you need to choose one of the four architectures. Yes, you need to follow the hero's journey. But you also need to have that information interaction design, which means a sense of what the story is about, how you're going to help the audience turn data into information, into knowledge, and what the sensory media are that are going to provide the best experience. It's a lot to balance, and it's what we're going to practice in the rest of this class.